I still shudder at the thought of what I witnessed in that estate. The estate that was disguised as a symbol of luxury and fame, but in reality, was a breeding ground for darkness and despair. They called it Hyan's Tip Estate, but I call it Hell's Pit. My name is Emeka Adalai, and I'm from the Igbo tribe. I used to work as a personal assistant to one of the owners of the estate in the heart of Lagos, a man named Ibrahim Suleiman. He was a wealthy businessman and a politician, with connections to the highest echelons of power in the country. I was hired to work for Ibrahim because of my skills in management and organization. I was young and ambitious, eager to make a name for myself in the business world. I thought working for someone as influential as Ibrahim would be a great opportunity for me to learn and grow. At first, everything seemed perfect. I was offered a job, a house, and an official card. The estate was a beautiful, sprawling complex with luxurious mansions, a private golf course, and a swimming pool. The residents were all wealthy and famous, and they lived lives that seemed like fantasies to ordinary people. I began to notice strange things. Ibrahim would often receive visitors in the dead of night, and they would have meetings that lasted for hours. I would see them performing rituals and chanting in hushed tones. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just some sort of business or cultural practice. Each night in the estate was filled with an air of celebration, parties everywhere. Young girls flooded the place, hooking up with celebrities and politicians who showered money on them. These girls' destinies was all they needed to feed the insatiable hunger of something so dark. However, as time went on, I started to realize that something was terribly wrong. The residents of the estate, despite their outward appearance of wealth and happiness, seemed to be living in a state of constant fear and anxiety. They would often receive mysterious messages and threats, and they would have to pay large sums of money to appease the senders. I also noticed that Mr. Ibrahim and the other three owners of the estate, Akim, Mark and Saidu, would often have secret meetings in a hidden chamber deep within the estate. They would emerge from these meetings looking pale and shaken, as if they had seen something that terrified them. As I settled into my new role as Ibrahim's personal assistant, I began to notice the subtle cracks in the facade of the estate's residence. Behind the glamour and glitz, I saw the faint outlines of sorrow, desperation, and fear. One of the residents, a famous actress named Neoma, would often host lavish parties that lasted till the wee hours of the morning. Ladies and guys would flood her house for the party. Some of these girls don't go home looking the same. But when the music stopped and the guests departed, I would see her sitting alone in her mansion, tears streaming down her face as she stared at old photographs of her family. Some of them sacrificed one or two loved ones unknowingly to get to where they are. Another resident, a renowned musician named Kemi, would often boast about his numerous awards and accolades. But when he thought no one was watching, I would see him popping pills and drinking excessively, as if trying to dull the pain of a secret he couldn't share with the world. As I got to know the residents better, I realized that they were all trapped in a web of deceit and darkness. They had made Faustian bargains with the four owners of the estate, trading their souls for fame and fortune. But the more I learned, the more I realized that I was in grave danger. I was just an ordinary guy from a humble background, and I had stumbled into a world of darkness and corruption. I tried to keep a low profile, but it was hard to avoid the attention of the estate's owners. They would often invite me to their secret meetings, where they would perform dark rituals and summon malevolent entities. I knew I had to escape, but I was trapped. I had signed a contract with Ibrahim, and I knew that if I tried to leave, they would stop at nothing to silence me. Being a personal assistant to such a man means I see and hear things others don't, exposed to some top secrets and more. As I tried to expose the truth about the estate and its dark secrets, I realized that the owners had a tight grip on the community. They had the police in their pocket, and any attempt to report their activities was met with resistance and intimidation. The small churches in the area were also affected, as if the estate owners had cast a spell of fear and submission over them. Many of the churches had packed up and left, unable to withstand the pressure and harassment from the estate owners. But there was one church that stood out, a grand and imposing structure that seemed to thrive under the patronage of the estate owners. It was a church that politicians and celebrities flocked to, eager to be seen and to curry favor with the influential ones. The stained glass windows of this church weren't the vibrant hues of traditional churches. Instead, they were a swirling, almost hypnotic blend of deep purples and shimmering obsidian, catching the Lagos twilight in a way that made the building seem to pulse. From the outside, it was a monument to modern architectural piety, sleek, imposing, a testament to the prosperity of its congregation. Inside, however, the air thrummed with a different kind of energy, a palpable tension that clung to the velvet drapes and polished marble floors. I'd been invited by a friend, a rising star in the Lagos social scene, who swore by the transformative power of the minister. He was a figure of undeniable charisma, his tailored suits and booming voice commanding attention, his sermons a blend of prosperity gospel and esoteric pronouncements that left the wealthy congregation nodding in fervent agreement. He spoke of ascension, of unlocking hidden potential, and of communion with higher realms. The church was structured like a corporate empire, a hierarchy of influence and access. The minister, of course, sat at the apex, his word law. Below him were the elders, a council of Lagos's most powerful figures, politicians, business magnates, and even a few well-known entertainers, who moved with an air of quiet authority. They managed the church's vast finances, oversaw its various departments, and acted as a buffer between the minister and the ordinary members. The choir, a meticulously curated ensemble of classical and contemporary trained singers, wasn't just a musical group, they were performers, their voices weaving a sonic tapestry that seemed to hypnotize the congregation. The instrumentalists, hidden behind a sleek, modern screen, produced a sound that was both ethereal and deeply resonant, a blend of traditional hymns and something else, something that vibrated in my bones. The children's department, a brightly painted space filled with expensive toys, was overseen by women with unnaturally serene smiles. I noticed a few children, looking dazed, being led into a back room, a room that always stayed locked. The youth department, a group of fashionable young adults, seemed less like a religious gathering and more like an exclusive social club. They were always impeccably dressed, their laughter echoing through the halls, but their eyes held a strange, vacant look. It was during one of the special communion services that I began to see the cracks in the facade. The air was thick with incense, the lights dimmed, and the minister's voice, amplified and distorted, filled the hall. He spoke of shedding earthly limitations, of becoming one with the divine. Then, the vulnerable members, those who were struggling, those who were desperate for answers, were led to the front. They were told to drink a special concoction, a dark, viscous liquid that shimmered in the dim light. What followed was a scene I still struggled to comprehend. Whispers turned into moans, then into cries. Some fell to the floor, writhing, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions. Others seemed to enter a trance, their eyes glazed over, their voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize. I saw my friend, his face pale and drawn, being led away by two of the elders, his eyes filled with a terrifying emptiness. At first I was unaware, of course, that the church was a front for the coven's activities, and that the minister was one of their key operatives. I poured out my heart to the minister, telling him about the strange occurrences at the estate and my growing sense of unease. He listened attentively, his eyes gleaming with a knowing light. "My son," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "you are troubled by the forces of darkness. But fear not, for we have the power to protect you." He laid his hands on me, and I felt a surge of energy flow through my body. But it was not the healing energy of the Holy Spirit, it was something darker, something that seemed to draw me deeper into the coven's web. I left the church feeling confused and uneasy, sensing that something was not quite right. But I could not shake off the feeling that I had just made my situation worse, that I had just walked further into the heart of darkness. As I walked out of the church, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The minister's words had seemed so reassuring, but now I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I tried to push the feeling aside, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. But as I walked back to my apartment, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't wait to get back to the safety of my apartment, to lock the door behind me and try to forget the strange encounter with the minister. But as I approached my apartment building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The minister was standing outside my door, a smile spreading across his face as he saw me approach. "Emeka, my son," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I see you're taking my advice to heart. You're seeking refuge in the Lord." I tried to push past him, but he grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Don't be afraid, Emeka," he said, his eyes glinting with a malevolent light. "We're here to help you. We're here to guide you on your journey." I tried to shake him off, but he held tight, his fingers digging deep into my skin. "You don't understand, Emeka," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You don't understand what's at stake. But you will. Oh, yes. You will." And with that, he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear. "You're one of us now, Emeka," he whispered. "You're one of the chosen." I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the truth. The minister was not what he seemed. He was a servant of the coven, a recruiter for their dark and sinister purposes. And I had just become their latest victim. I tried to pull away, but the minister's grip was too strong. He held me in place, his eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. "You don't understand, Emeka," he repeated, his voice low and hypnotic. "You don't understand the power that we possess. But you will. Oh, yes. You will." As he spoke, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if my mind was being clouded, my thoughts growing foggy and indistinct. I tried to resist, but it was too late. The minister's words had already taken hold, planting a seed of darkness in my mind. And then, everything went black. When I regained my spirit, I was lying on the floor of my apartment, my head throbbing with pain. The minister was nowhere to be seen, but I knew that I had been initiated into the coven's dark world. I stumbled to my feet, my mind reeling with the implications. I knew that I had to get out of there, to escape the coven's clutches before it was too late. But as I reached for the door, I felt a strange sensation in my pocket. It was a small piece of paper, folded into a neat square. I unfolded it, and my heart sank. It was a message, scrawled in red ink. "You are one of us now. You will do our bidding." I knew then that I was trapped, caught in the coven's web of darkness and deceit. And I knew that I would have to fight to survive, to resist the coven's influence and reclaim my soul. But for now, I was at their mercy. And I knew that I would have to do their bidding, no matter how terrible the cost. As I stood there, frozen in horror, I knew that I had to comply with the coven's demands. I was their pawn now, and I had to play by their rules. My first assignment was to initiate a young and upcoming actress named Kechi. She was beautiful, talented, and ambitious, with a promising career ahead of her. I was given instructions on how to approach her, what to say, and what to do. I was told to use my charm and charisma to win her trust, to make her believe that I was genuinely interested in helping her career. I met Nkechi at a trendy coffee shop in Lagos. She was even more beautiful than I had expected, with a radiant smile and sparkling eyes. We chatted for a while, discussing her career aspirations and the challenges she faced in the competitive world of movie industry. As we talked, I subtly introduced the idea of spiritual guidance and support. I told her that I knew someone who could help her achieve her dreams, someone who had the power to make things happen. Nkechi was skeptical at first, but I could see the desperation in her eyes. She was willing to try anything to succeed, and I knew that I had her right where the coven wanted her. I took her to meet the minister, who performed a ritual that supposedly cleansed her of negative energies and opened her up to spiritual guidance. Nkechi was entranced, believing that she had finally found the key to unlocking her true potential. Over the next few weeks, I watched as Nkechi became more and more entrenched in the coven's teachings. She began to attend their meetings, to participate in their rituals, and to spread their message to her friends and colleagues. And then, there was the musician, Femi. He was a talented young man with a voice like honey and a style that was uniquely his own. But he was struggling to make a name for himself in the competitive world of Nigerian music. I was instructed to approach him, to offer him a record deal that would launch his career into the stratosphere. But of course, there was a catch. Femi would have to agree to collaborate with the coven, to use his music to spread their message and recruit new members. Femi was hesitant at first, but the promise of fame and fortune was too enticing to resist. He signed the contract, and soon found himself performing at the coven's gatherings, using his music to enthrall and entice new recruits. As the months went by, Femi became more and more entrenched in the coven's teachings. He began to see himself as a messenger of the divine, using his music to spread the coven's message of spiritual enlightenment and empowerment. And then, there was the politician, Senator Ademola. He was a ruthless and cunning man, willing to do whatever it took to achieve his goals. But he was also a man with a secret, a man who was haunted by the demons of his past. I was instructed to approach him, to offer him a deal that would secure his place in the coven's inner circle. But of course, there was a catch. Senator Ademola would have to agree to use his power and influence to further the coven's agenda, to help them achieve their goals of spiritual domination and control. Senator Ademola was the easiest, because the promise of power, wealth, and protection was too enticing to resist. He agreed to the deal, and soon found himself using his influence to promote the coven's interests. As the months went by, I watched as Senator Ademola became more and more rooted in the coven's strategies. He began to see himself as a divine instrument, using his power and influence to shape the world according to the coven's design. And so, the coven's influence continued to spread, as more and more people were drawn into their web of deceit and corruption. I was just a small part of their machine, a pawn in their game of spiritual manipulation and control. But I knew that I couldn't keep playing this role forever. I knew that I had to find a way to escape, to break free from the coven's grasp and expose their evil plans to the world. As the days went by, I became more and more entrenched in the coven's activities. I was attending their meetings regularly, participating in their rituals, and even recruiting new members. But despite my outward appearance of devotion, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was wrong. My mother, a devout Christian, was the first to notice the change in me. She would often comment on the strange symbols I wore on my clothing, or the odd hours I kept. Each time I visited. At first, I brushed off her concerns, telling her that I was just going through a phase. But my mother was not so easily convinced. She began to pray for me, seeking guidance from her pastor and the members of her church. She would often invite me to attend church services with her, hoping that the message of salvation and redemption would penetrate my heart. At first, I resisted her efforts, feeling embarrassed and defensive about my involvement with the coven. but my mother's persistence and love eventually wore me down. I began to attend church services with her, and slowly but surely, I started to see the world in a different light. One day, my mother invited me to meet with her pastor, a wise and compassionate man named Pastor Adeyemi. He listened to my story, his eyes filled with concern and compassion. He asked me questions, probing the depths of my involvement with the coven and the motivations behind my actions. As I spoke, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. For the first time, I saw my involvement with the coven for what it was, a desperate attempt to find meaning and purpose in a world that seemed empty and devoid of hope. Pastor Adeyemi listened attentively, his face a picture of empathy and understanding. When I finished speaking, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "Emeka, my son, you have been deceived. The coven's promises of power and protection are nothing but lies. They are using you for their own purposes, and they will discard you when you are no longer useful." His words struck a chord in me. I knew that he was right. I knew that I had been living a lie, and that it was time to make a change. As I sat in Pastor Adeyemi's office, he smiled warmly at me and said, "Emeka, my son, I'm glad you've made the decision to leave the coven behind. But I know it won't be easy. They will try to find you, to silence you. That's why we need to take steps to protect you. Your mother has shown dedication to her services to God in this church, helping the widows and the less privileged with her time, resources, and prayers." He paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. "We've arranged for you to have a new identity, Emeka. A new name, a new backstory, a new life. You'll be able to start fresh abroad, without the coven's influence hanging over you." I felt a wave of relief wash over me at his words. A new identity, a new life, it was exactly what I needed. "What's my new name?" I asked. Curiously, Pastor Adeyemi smiled again, this time with a hint of mischief in his eyes. "Your new name is Emmanuel Okoro," he said, handing me a small folder containing my new identification documents. "You're from a small town in Rivers State, and you're moving to the UK to start a new life." I took the folder, feeling a sense of excitement and trepidation. Emmanuel Okoro, it was a name I would have to get used to. "When do I leave?" I asked, looking up at Pastor Adeyemi. "You'll be leaving tomorrow night," he replied, his expression serious. "We've arranged for you to fly out of Lagos, and then connect to a flight to London. You'll be met at the airport by a member of our church, who will help you get settled." I nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude towards Pastor Adeyemi and the church. Also thanking God for blessing me with my mother. They had saved me from the coven's clutches, and were now giving me a chance to start anew. "Thank you, Pastor," I said, my voice filled with emotion. Pastor Adeyemi smiled, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You're welcome, Emmanuel," he said. "Remember, you're not alone. You have a new family now, a family that will support and protect you. Just be careful, and always trust in the Lord." I nodded, feeling a sense of peace wash over me. I knew that I still had a long way to go, but with my new identity and the church's support, I felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead.